My name is Stephen, and today we're continuing our series on the Acts of the Apostles. This is episode number 30, Acts chapter 18, verses 1 to 23. We're going to be looking at Paul's ministry at Corinth. Let's just jump right into it. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Here's the map, and we're going to be focusing on Achaia. And we were at Athens, and now we moved westward towards Corinth. Now, the city of Corinth, it was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BCE before it was refounded again in the year 44. So it's been less than or just about 100 years since its refounding, which means that it's a young city without the old aristocracy. So the social hierarchy wasn't very well established yet. There were many families who were there for generations, and so it was a place of commerce because it was a seaport, and the place of the self-made man. So if you are someone who's poor but you're ambitious, so Corinth is the place to go to if you want to have a shot at the Corinthian dream, the rags to riches story. No better place to do it than at Corinth. So it's a very competitive, cutthroat, and a place for ambitious people, people who are chasing for social status, people who are chasing for wealth, and that is basically Corinth, and it is the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, on the Acro Corinth. So all kind of hanky-panky stuff happens there at the temple of Aphrodite. Basically, this was considered a rather sinful city even by ancient standards. Now, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So Claudius here refers to the Emperor Claudius. So what is this event where Claudius commanded all the Jews to leave Rome? Well, this was known as the Edict of Claudius. We read about it in Suetonius, roughly about the year 49. I'll talk about why this particular year at the end of this episode. But around the year 49, uh, the Emperor Claudius issued an order to expel the Jews from Rome. And this is what Suetonius wrote. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Crassus, he, the Emperor Claudius, expelled them from Rome. So what happened was that the Jews were having a debate. There were this controversy over Christus. Now, many scholars think that Christus is probably a misspelling of Christus, misspelling of Christ. Now, if that is the case, then likely what happened was that at some point, perhaps on the day of Pentecost or something, some of these Jews from Rome went there, heard the gospel of Jesus Christ, believed in Jesus, and went back to Rome to start the Jesus community. And so there was this debate between among the Jews in Rome as to whether Jesus was the Christ. And so that probably got violent, and so there were disturbances. So the Emperor Claudius just expelled all of them from Rome, whether they're believers or non-believers in Jesus. So Priscilla and Aquila were among the believers, Jewish believers, and they were also commanded to leave Rome. Now, if you want to then um, restart your business, where would you want to go? Corinth sounds like a great city because that is where you can make a living. So he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, Paul was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. So let's take a look at Paul's ministry in Corinth. So he moved in with um, Aquila and Priscilla. Why? Because he was also a tent maker, like them. So uh, probably what this means is that Paul ran out of funds by the time he reached Corinth, perhaps because he left Macedonia rather hurriedly, went to Athens, didn't succeed in founding a church, or it was never his intention to found a church there in the first place. And so by the time he reached Corinth, he was probably broke. And so he was tent making on regular days and evangelizing on Sabbaths. Now, I know that there's this terminology called tent making ministry, and I respect that people who want to put a lot of time to ministry, but also want to support themselves and do not want to burden the church or sponsors. So they work as doctors, work as all kinds of jobs in order to support themselves, but they see themselves as primarily evangelists or pastors. Now, and that is called a time maker. But I don't think that is the right terminology for it. It is a valid form of serving the Lord. Absolutely respect that. But I think what Paul's intention was not to be a time maker. He really wanted to preach the gospel full time, as we will see very quickly. But that he had no choice at this point in time. He had to move in with Aquila and Priscilla in order to make tents so that he is able to evangelize on Sabbath. And here, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, he was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus, right? So Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, that means from places like Philippi, where we know that the Philippians had this arrangement with Paul to support his ministry financially. So when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, that means they brought funds with them. And so Paul went back into full-time ministry. Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that Christ was Jesus. So again, I would say that if Paul had a choice, he would rather preach the gospel full-time, but because he didn't have an option at that time, so he was tent making. But if you are into tent making ministry, the phrase that is being used in our own context to mean that I want to be in ministry, but I want to be self-supporting, that is also fine. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I'm innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." So he was rejected by the synagogue, and he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshipper of God. So he went. His house was next door to the synagogue, and so this is very, very interesting. You can see why this is going to escalate to greater heights. This problem between the Jewish unbelievers and the believers in Jesus, rejected by the synagogue, but went next door. So it's like in the Malaysian context, you think that that everywhere there's 7-Eleven, and then you open up KK next door, that kind of a thing. Um, Accepted by Titus Justus as a Gentile God-fearer, but not just Gentiles, also Jews. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household. So Crispus quit his position at the synagogue and also went next door with Paul, Titius Justus. That's where the church was meeting. And many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Now, the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." Now, think about it. Why did the Lord appear to Paul in this vision? Why say, "Do not be afraid, but go on speaking. Do not be silent," because maybe Paul was a bit discouraged at this point. Wherever he go, people just rejected him, right? Especially the Jews, but also the Gentiles. Everywhere he went, he get chased out. He couldn't be in a particular location for more than a couple of months. So it's very hard for him to establish a base. He's so far away from Antioch, where he was sent from, and he needs to, if he wants to move westward, if he wants to bring the gospel further to the west or anywhere else, he needs to have a new base in that region. But everywhere he went, he just couldn't establish a base because people would chase him out very, very soon. But here the Lord said to Paul, "I'm with you. No one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people." So because he could stay at one place for 18 months, so he could then establish the church there, more than that, establish a base from which he can launch future expeditions, right? Future missionary trips. And this is the longest he's at any one place up to now. Eventually, he will be in Ephesus for 2 years, but up to now, this is the place he spent the longest time in teaching the word of God among them, which is why it's rather sad to read First Corinthians, where the Corinthians just rejected Paul, even though he spent so much time with them. Nonetheless, the Lord encouraged Paul to continue preaching in Corinth because the Lord's presence was with Paul. That is the most important thing, isn't it? And Paul would not be harmed, for the Lord had many in Corinth who were his people. He doesn't have to quit the city very soon. He can work to galvanize and solidify the church in Corinth. And the result is that, of course, he ministered in Corinth for 18 months. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." So this is the Jewish and Christ followers in public dispute, and the accusation was that Paul was persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. Now, there's very little information about what Paul did in Corinth. That wasn't, I think, the point of this passage. I think right here about Gallio, this united attack brought about by the Jewish unbelievers, this accusation on Paul that Paul was persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. To what law? Is it contrary to Jewish law, contrary to Roman law? And brought this matter to the proconsul of Achaia. I think that what is going on is that the author Luke, he is trying to he's writing to Theophilus and also people like him and say, all right, is Christianity, or is this Christ movement, this Jesus movement, against the law? And this will have great impact because Paul later we will read that he appealed to Caesar, is on his way to Rome. Luke journeyed with him. He's supposed to make his defense. So I think that this writing serves as part of that preparation to convince people that what Paul was preaching was not against the law and definitely not against Roman law in this particular case. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, before he could even put up his defense, Leo said there's no need to put up a defense. If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. So Gallio says, Paul, you don't have to defend yourself here. He just threw the case out of court because the charge was not about a crime under Roman law. It is about Jewish law. So it is an intra-Jewish theological debate. Rome has no interest in that kind of a debate. So there's no need for Paul to even defend himself. That is what Gallio is saying. That is what Luke is telling to Theophilus, and that would be the defense to Caesar. So Paul appealed to Caesar, right? So I think Luke is part of this preparing Paul's defense for Caesar to say, look, Gallio said there is no need for Paul to defend him. This is about intra-Jewish theological debate, right? So this is not a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crime under Roman law. I think that this is a very, very important point that Luke is trying to make to his readers. And he drove them from the tribunal, and they all seized Sosthenes, the new ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. Now, some manuscript says it's not the Jews who beat up Sosthenes, but it is the Greeks who beat up Sosthenes. But nonetheless, whatever it is, Gallio could not be baited to try this particular case. He just threw the matter out of court. Gallio threw it out of court. So should Caesar. I think that is the message that is going on here. Now, why 49? Edict of Claudius, because in the year 51, Gallio became proconsul of Achaia. How do we know? Because we found an inscription at Delphi that says Gallio, the one that is highlighted in the box in red, is the name Gallio, and that he was proconsul of Achaia in the year 51. So if Paul had been there for 18 months, we work backwards, so the edict of Claudius would be the year 49. In fact, this particular date about Gallio being proconsul of Achaia is the basis for which we did everything else in the Acts of the Apostles, backwards and forwards. From there, we can trace all the way back to the opening pages of the book of Acts, and also to the end of the book of Acts as well. So this is an important date, an important event, because we have the archaeological evidence for it. After this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria. And with him, Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. So Paul was keeping a vow. Maybe why was he keeping a vow? Was he thinking that he needs to go back to Jerusalem and there could be trouble? And so he made a vow on that because God appeared to him at Corinth, and so he made a vow. It's hard to know. But nonetheless, this was part of the Nazarite vow. So a lot of people say that Paul was anti-Judaism. No, he wasn't anti-Judaism or anti-Jewish at all. Rather, that is part of his culture, that is part of his understanding, that was part of his own relationship with God. But his his point was that this is not a matter of salvation. One is not saved by works of the law, but one is saved by grace through faith. So justification is by faith and not by any of these things. It's not against any of the Jewish people doing any of these things, but that do not make it an article of faith. Do not say that if you do not do this, then you are not saved. You are not a follower of Christ, or that you have no place among the people of God. That was his point. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. He left Priscilla and Aquila at 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 Ephesus, but he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. He has to go back to Antioch. But on taking leave of them, he said, "I will return to you if God wills." And he set sail from Ephesus. Now we're going to come back to Ephesus in the next episode. This just sets up for Paul's eventual ministry at Ephesus, but he left Priscilla and Aquila there to kind of spearhead that the effort, the gospel effort at Ephesus. So he set sail from Ephesus and landed at Caesarea in the Holy Land, went up and greeted the church. That meant that he went up to Jerusalem and he greeted the church in Jerusalem, and then went down back to Antioch, and that would end the second missionary journey. After spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next through the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. And we're going to be looking at the third missionary journey in the next episode. But until then, God bless you, and see you in the next episode.